I say this with my tongue in cheek, but there's only 2 times in my life that I've felt like committing suicide. The first time was when I saw Taekwondo in the Olympics, and the second time was when I saw karate in the Olympics. Because when I saw the Taekwondo, I was disgusted to think that Taekwondo in any way is connected to anything I do. The way that they'd fight with their arms in front of us, it was so not real Taekwondo.
Welcome to It's Not About the Fight. I'm Ross Cameron, martial artist, coach, and lifelong student of combat sports. I've had the privilege of being able to work with some of the best in the industry, UFC champions, world-class jiu-jitsu competitors, and elite martial artists from all over the world. Now I'm bringing those lessons to you. Let's get to work. Today on To Not About the Fight, we're honoured to have on one of the most respected martial artists around, Mr. Cameron Quinn. How are you, Cameron?
Morning, Ross.
How's life?
Pretty good. A lot less to complain about than to be happy for, that's for sure.
Great. So I've got a few questions for you.
Okie doke.
So the first one is, when did you start your martial arts journey and what attracted you to Kyokushin?
Well, my sisters were teenagers, and I guess my parents were a little concerned. Then there was some information in the local Gold Coast Bulletin about a new karate club that had started. At that stage, the Gold Coast has more martial arts schools per capita than any city in the world. But at that stage, there was one traditional jiu-jitsu school, one Kyokushin dojo that had started early in 1971. And my mum took my sisters to the karate club one night, hoping that they'd be interested in learning some self-defense. But they were completely uninterested. They just sat there sulking. But I got up the back and I couldn't stop. I was hooked. Whether it was good fortune or whatever, it was a Kyokushin dojo run by Frank Everett, who was an amazingly inspiring young man. He was only young at the time. He was in his mid-30s. He had a tremendous life. He was an undefeated Golden Gloves boxing champion. He even fought the Australian professional champion in his weight division in the military, because in the military they don't pay attention to pro or amateur. So in the military championship, he knocked out the Australian professional champion as well. But anyway, that's how I got started in late 1971, September 71. Thanks to my sisters, here we are.
I have a very similar sort of scenario. My brother was starting judo and I got dragged along, and that's it. Next minute I'm in there, and I was 4 at the stage, so I was too young to grade or anything, and I was just running around like a mat rat, running around everywhere.
Yep.
So yeah. Thanks to my brother, I'm hooked in martial arts.
Well, I wasn't 4. I was 12 going on 13, but when I was 4, I don't think many martial arts schools existed in Queensland.
Yeah, we were lucky. We had, I think there was judo under a guy called Ivan Willis, and Ivan also was a karate black belt and an aikido black belt. So he was teaching a few styles. So
interesting.
So what was it like in your early experiences going to Japan? How did you get there? What happened?
Well, I was hooked on karate in grade 8 in 71, did a little bit. And then I went off to boarding school for 2 years. And so during that time, I hardly trained at all, to be quite honest. I was involved with cricket and rugby and all those things. And being at boarding school meant that I didn't have access to the karate club. And then when I got back, January 74, I really reawakened my desire to do karate. I was literally training 7 days a week. See, the thing is, I was very short. I was 145 centimeters, which isn't very tall for a grade 11 kid. It's about 4'10" in the old language. So I was shorter than all the girls and all the boys, and I was shorter than all the boys in grade 10 as well. So anyway, I was studying physical education at school. Miami High School was a very innovative school in many respects. The surfing world owes a lot to Miami High School because of many reasons, but they were also the second school in Queensland to introduce physical education as a board subject. So I was doing that. And I remember I was up in the library reading some papers about training stimulus, and I was very interested in yoga and martial arts. I bought my first martial arts books in 72, 73, and one of them was Tohei Koichi's book called Ki in Daily Life. So that became like a little bit of a daily read, regular Bible for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was interested in the Ki. And then I remember reading something about primal screaming. And I think I don't know too much about it, but I think primal screaming was like a form of therapy. And their theory was by screaming and yelling, you release a lot of blockages in the body. And I thought, well, there's a ki for you. And interestingly, the word ki, which, as you know, it kind of means to meet your spirit, and your ki could be your spirit, and I means to coordinate or meet. So primal screaming, if you like, is one possible translation of the word ki. And I'd read where high levels of extreme exercise and yelling, this primal screaming, stimulated bone tip growth in developing youth. And I thought, that's exactly what I mean. I didn't want to be 4'10" anymore. So I was kiing louder than anyone in the dojo, and I was training 7 days a week, literally 7 days a week. I had a mate named Roger Chadwick, and sometimes on Saturday nights we'd go to school parties. But the arrangement was whoever woke up first would wake up the other one, and we'd hitchhike to 8 a.m. training down at Burleigh, and we'd train on the morning session at Burleigh as well. So my earliest experience was how energized and invigorated and almost blissful I was at the training. I grew 20 centimeters in that 1 year, so turned out to be right, that intense levels of training. And and we were doing Frank was an amazing trainer, and at the same time, I became very interested in Mas Oyama, and I found out he was still alive and still teaching. So I decided I was going to save up some money and go and train with him in Japan. So I was working weekends at some of the high-rise buildings around Surfers Paradise. Back then, there were only 3 or 4 high-rise buildings. But then at some stage, I did a calculation that if I keep going the rate I'm going and saving the money at the rate I'm saving, I'm only going to have enough money to go to Japan for 1 or 2 months. And that wasn't enough. So I tried to work out a way where I could go to Japan and do it at someone else's expense. And then I met a young Japanese guy named Shuji Ozeki. We're still friends to this day, 50 years later. And he was a Rotary exchange student. So he said, well, you should look into Rotary. So I contacted Rotary, and I found out about their Rotary exchange program. And what they do is they provide you accommodation, school, and food, essentially, for 12 months. And I thought, well, that's exactly what I'm looking for. So I applied for the scholarship. I got the scholarship to go and live and train in Japan, and did it for a period of time which was way beyond what I could have done. So I was there for 12 months. I was the youngest ever non-Japanese to go and train at the Hombu under Mas Oyama. And the experiences ranged from totally fearful to very empowering, So it was a really good opportunity. I was there at a time where, they weren't really used to foreigners at that stage.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a 17-year-old kid, and I was actually not even a very mature 17-year-old. I think of some of my friends and some fighters, 17, 18, 19, they're already world-class fighters, and I was nothing like that. I was just really interested in the martial arts. So it was a very empowering 12 months. I certainly grew up very quickly.
And what was it like for you to rock up to the Hombu dojo, like you say, as a 17-year-old, and meet Masayama for the first time? How was that experience?
Yeah, there was a secretary there named Christine Wilby. Christine was a New Zealander who'd gone to Japan to train and ended up becoming the secretary for Hombu. So when I walked first of all, the first thing was walking around the corner from the Ikebukuro station, and you walk around, there was a corner, and there's Hombu, and your heart skips a beat. I mean, seriously, here is the Hombu dojo of Kyokushin. Very few people from Australia had ever been there to train. I certainly had dreams about this, and there it is in front of you. So your heart skips a beat, palpitate a little bit because you don't know what to expect. You'd heard all kinds of stories about the intensity of the training. And then I walked in, I went to reception, and I just said in English, oh, hi, I'm here to sign up. They couldn't speak English, so they called for Christine. And Christine came downstairs, and I first met Christine that way. And she helped me sign up. And then at some stage, whilst I'm signing up, there was a little bit of a shuffle and kerfuffle, and it turns out that Mas Oyama was returning. So everyone's running downstairs, and they stand there and line up. And as he'd walk in, I turned around, and I'm looking at him, and he walks over to me and looked me and smiled and shook my hand and said, oh, welcome to my dojo. And that was it. That was the introduction. And the only time I used to see him after that for a while was at the end of training. He would come down and close the training. I wasn't necessarily training with him. I was training with a guy named Matsuda, Toru Matsuda, and there's another guy named Nakamura, Sensei Nakamura. His first name escapes me. But the British Kyokushin and the amazing kickers of British Kyokushin, like Michael Thompson, Nick DaCosta, Jeff Wybrow, a lot of these guys owe a lot to Nakamura Sensei, because whilst I was there in Japan in 1976, he got sent off to England and he was teaching in England. Tatsuo, Nakamura Tatsuo, his name was. I have a bittersweet memory of him because he knocked me out cold in the first training session that I attended. And all Christine had said to me was, no matter what happens, just stand back up again and say, and that was pretty ominous. And so I stood up again. And the second time when he threw that kick, I had my hand up at least, but my hand went in and hit my nose. So that's where I learned about your hand's better here than here. It's okay if you got gloves on, but with bare hands, it's going to knock you out. So, but anyway, the blood went everywhere, and I couldn't speak Japanese at that stage, and they're all running around, and I'm feeling sorry for myself, and I'm thinking, well, at least they're showing, they're rushing around, they're showing some compassion to me. And then finally, one comes over with a wet rag. He goes, "You, Gaijin, go, get," because all they were worried about was my blood on the wooden floor. They didn't care about me at all. And which you have to remember that the Japanese, with their Shinto origins, blood is dirty. So in their tradition, blood is not acceptable the same way as we accept it. So anyway, I was training under Nakamura Tatsuo and Matsuda Toru. Matsuda Toru was arguably one of the great kickers of Kyokushin. He was a phenomenal kicker. I remember once when I was talking to Matsui Shoke, I mentioned that I'd trained with Matsuda Toru. And Matsui, who, of course, is well known in the Kyokushin world, one of the greats, he said, "You trained with Matsuda Toru. What was he like?" And even he, because Matsui didn't start until a little later, and even he was quite surprised. He wanted to know about Matsuda Toru. So there's plenty of stories about him as well. It's quite amusing. Yeah.
Interesting. I've watched Matsui's 100-man kumites and just the kicking ability and the angles and footwork and timing. It's just beautiful to watch.
He's literally in the elite. I remember when he came back, he had after the world tournament and after a few things, he had to go away and he was working. He became a bit of a businessman. And so he was out of Hombu for 4 years. And then he had to come back to prepare for his 5th dan. So I was training with him every day to help him with his 5th dan. We'd go for a run. And the thing I remember about running was I was quite a reasonable runner. I wasn't champion level. When I was at school, I was a little kid. But as it got older, of course, I wasn't particularly a good runner. I wasn't bad, but I could run. I ran consistently. And I remember about Matsui is we'd be running along and he'd go, "Ah, man, you run so fast." And I just go, "Oh, no, we'll be fine," because I'm helping him, remember? And then we'd go, there was a hill in front of Solsai's apartment. We used to do laps. So we do hill sprints up this hill. And then it's about another 4Ks or 5Ks back to Hombu. And all I remember about Matsui was he didn't slow down. He did the sprints and then he'd run. And then the last 4Ks, he'd get second by second faster. And by the time we got to Hombu, I'm going, "Oh man, he's the one who's running." I said, "You're fast. You're not. I'm not fast. You're the fast one." So he just had that incredible, indefatigable stamina that he just kept going and going and going.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it?
I remember when we got back to Hombu one day, we'd go downstairs and we used to spar because he'd been out of touch. So he wanted to so we were sparring and he's going, "Man," I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Oh, all my timing's gone. All my speed's gone." I said, "Don't worry, it'll come back." And then the next thing I remember, I'm moving. I just went and I looked at him and nothing had moved. His head hadn't moved. His shoulders hadn't moved. He'd just thrown this roundhouse kick and he'd put it right on my cheek and brought it back. And I looked at him and he goes, "Maybe I've still got a little bit of speed left." And it was just, I never forgot it. It was quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a similar situation with Yun. Yun kicked me 3 times, and the guys standing around said they couldn't see the second and third one.
Amazing.
They just heard it. I felt it.
I ran into Master Yun on an aeroplane once. And I think he knew about Masayama, and both of them being Korean, I think he had respect for Masayama. So when I introduced myself as one of Masayama's students, he was, very happy.
Yeah. Yeah, he always used to talk of Masayama in great reverence, and the Kyokushin students. He would always talk about the discipline and the focus that all these Kyokushin students had, and that's what he was trying to achieve through his guys, and very much respect shown. So nowadays, you're a BJJ black belt as well. How do you see the two things working together, striking and grappling?
Look, it's interesting, Ross. These days, see, I think even Masayama said that originally there was all one. It was all called taijutsu. Taijutsu just means the physical fighting, body arts, physical techniques. So there's no separation. And in my theory, I think, well, at some stage, someone said, well, I want to focus on weapons. And someone else said, yeah, I'm really good at that choking business, so I'm going to crack arms and choke. And someone else says, yeah, but I'm quick on my feet, so I'm going to create some distance and use punches and kicks. And so gradually, this one system, which incorporated everything, split. And if you think about it, if someone had to fight for their life or to defend their family and they were a karate fighter, it's not that they're going to go, well, look, I'm going to defend my life and save my family, but I'm only going to use karate techniques. They would use everything. They would headbutt, they'd bite, they'd gouge in the eye, they'd break, they'd snap fingers. They'd do everything they can to survive. And so the reality is the only thing that separates the martial arts is the set of rules that we choose to train under and compete under. And many years ago, I listed all the techniques that Masayama taught and all the techniques that are recorded by him. So all the techniques in his famous 3 books. And 72% of the techniques that he taught were not allowed in Kyokushin tournaments. So even though Kyokushin is famous for its full contact tournaments, nearly 3/4 of what Masayama taught were not allowed in those tournaments. The tournaments only represent a very small tip of the iceberg part of what Kyokushin is. And Kyokushin, of course, it stems out of Goju karate and Shotokan, and they come from Okinawan karate. And we have to remember that when the old masters who created the kata that we all use these days, including Taekwondo has its roots in Shotokan. They were all judo 4th, 5th dans and things like this. And they were all very highly graded and skilled in the grappling arts as well. So that's why you'll have certain things in a kata where there's the only possible explanation for it is that it involves a grappling movement. I was with my good buddy Brad Madam in Sydney once many years ago in about I think it would have been 1994 because the first UFC was 12th of November 1993. So that was the thing that allowed me to feel comfortable with my thinking that there's more to it than just the punches and kicks. And the other beautiful thing was Frank Everett, my first Kyokushin instructor, was also a black belt in traditional jiu-jitsu. So every night there was 2 classes. There was a beginner's class and a general class. And I used to go to both of them for a long time. But for the first 3 months, before you could even attend the senior class, you had to go to the beginner's class. And that involved a lot of jiu-jitsu, a lot of joint locks, wrist locks, control movements with elbows and come-alongs and grabs and so on. So that from the very start, Frank was, even though he's very Kyokushin, his origins were Goju with Tino Sobrano. But when Kato Shigeo came to Australia in 1967, he immediately gravitated towards Kato Sensei.
Yeah, I had an interview with Tino a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about Frank. Yeah, he said he was an extremely skilled martial artist and a really nice guy.
And very down to earth. He had a poster on his wall which said, "There are no strangers here, just friends we haven't met yet." And that was what Frank was like. Everyone was a buddy, a mate, and a pal. You'd walk in, you go, if you 3 walked in, you go, "Hey mates, hey buddies, hey pals," like that. He was friends with everyone. I gave a eulogy at his funeral, and the funny thing was, no one ever saw Frank sitting down. He always stood up at his gym. He didn't even have a chair behind the counter. He only stood up. So at the funeral, they stood his coffin up. They didn't even, they didn't lie it down. Very interesting guy. But that influence of his jiu-jitsu on my karate meant that even when I went to Japan, sometimes you'd say to guys, well, what's this movement in this kata? And they go, oh, that's just a block and a punch. You go, but couldn't that also be an arm lock? They go, no, it's just a block. And so there is this area of training where people will insist that a block is a block, a punch is a punch, and that has value to a degree, especially when you're learning moves to start with. Don't get too caught up in the block being a lock and it's all that sort of stuff. And
yeah, I had an interesting moment not so long ago. We were talking about Bunkai, and someone was saying, I don't want to tell you what the Bunkai is because I want you to think about what it means to you, what that movement out of the pattern actually means. How you apply it could be totally different to how I apply it.
Exactly. In Japan, there's a saying, Junin Toiro. Junin means 10 people. Toiro means 10 colors. So you could say to a class, well, let's just focus on this first and second move out of this particular kata and spend 10 minutes, see what you come up with. And they'll all come up with something different.
Yep.
It might be similar, but it's surprising what a wide range of interpretations there are if you allow them the freedom to interpret. But if you say, this is the way it's done, this is what I want you to be thinking about, well, then I think you limit them. So at some stage, I'm with my buddy Brad Hanson. The two Brads from Mackay were both great fighters. But Brad Hanson and I were in Sydney, and we heard about a guy teaching some grappling in North Sydney. I think he was at the North Sydney PCYC or something. And I looked, with all due love and respect, I can't even remember. I just met him that one time, so I don't recall his name. But he taught me a loop choke. And I remember thinking, dang, that's very cool. And then at some stage later on, I found a copy of 1950 Sports Illustrated magazine. And it was at a time when they were talking about Rocky Marciano, the world heavyweight boxing champion, fighting Lou Thez, the world wrestling champion. This is like 1950. And they were interviewing all these fighters. And one of the fighters was Mas Togo, one of the Togo brothers, which was Mas Oyama's. That's the name he used to travel around with.
Mm-hmm.
And Mas Togo was asked who he thought would win between the stand-up fighter and the grappler. And he said, well, look, there's no denying that Rocky Marciano's punch is as hard as it could possibly get. He's the great boxer. But if the wrestler gets hold of him and takes him to the ground and he doesn't know what to do, he's in big, big trouble. Now, this is Masayama, the champion of stand-up fighting, saying this. And I found that really fascinating. So, of course, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu still didn't really exist in Australia at that time. Maybe, I think, Pete DeBean from Torquay, he had struck up a very close friendship with Carlos Gracie Jr., so he was traveling to Brazil. He'd been training with John Will, and I remember one day I was in Geelong visiting my Kyokushin buddies. Geelong's a real Kyokushin stronghold. And I ran into John Will on the street, and I think this would have been maybe 94 or 95. I was like, oh, man, he'd just come back. Don't hold me to those dates. I could be wrong. He'd just come back from Brazil where he interviewed Rickson Gracie for Blitz magazine. At that stage, he still owned Blitz. And he said, oh, you wouldn't believe this stuff. It's so good. And I'm going, yeah, I'm really keen. Show me. So he took me back to his dojo in Geelong, and he was actually teaching. What he was actually teaching was a karate footwork movement, but using it as an entry into a double leg. And he was coming in and do the double leg. And then he was teaching me aspects of the guard. And this is, John Will, who's highly experienced in BJJ now. This would have been immediately after his first ever exposure. So he'd been to Brazil to interview Rickson Gracie, and no doubt Rickson Gracie showed him some stuff. And so he was so excited about it that he had this keenness. It was kind enough of him to show me the whole thing. And that's my first exposure to BJJ. And then what happened was I was flying with Qantas I was flying as a flight attendant, and I used to do Los Angeles trips back to back. And the hotel we stayed in, by coincidence, was right across the road, literally across a very narrow street to the Machado Brothers dojo. And I popped in there and I was training at the Machado Brothers whenever I'd go to LA. And there weren't many people. There were literally half a dozen people. So it was Carlos Machado before he moved to Texas. Carlos Machado was teaching, and John Machado on that day was teaching. Jean-Jacques wasn't teaching there at that time. And I just fell in love with it. And I remember, and I was so fit from Kyokushin training. Literally, I doubt whether most BJJ guys could get through a real Kyokushin warm-up, let alone a Kyokushin session. Stand-up fighters have to be a lot fitter because you can't flop to your bum and sit down. You're on your feet the whole time. So just by the nature of the game, stand-up fighters are fitter. And within the stand-up fighters, as you know, you've seen Kyokushin tournaments, the fitness demands are pretty crazy. So I was really fit at that time. And when it came to rolling at the end, I'm like Taz. Who's next? Who's next? Who's next? Who's next? Who's next? And at one stage, Carlos Machado said to me, "You karate guys," he said, if I fight, you have one opportunity to punch me, to kick me. If you get me, beautiful, all power to you. But if you miss, 100% guaranteed that you'll lose the fight. And I remember thinking, yeah, that's actually, if I was an idiot, I wouldn't take any notice of that. But that's actually very eye-opening. And the number of times I've spoken to stand-up fighters in the early days, I think they're different now, especially Muay Thai fighters, people like that, who are going, nah, if they come in to grab me, I'm just going to knee them or I'm just going to punch them. But the point is, it's like a bullet. That bullet's only going to miss you by 2 inches and it has no effect. Well, it's the same. If they throw that punch or kick and the opponent has the experience and the ability to close the gap. See, there's an old saying in Japanese, 1 foot in front of the blade and you're in hell. 2 foot forward and you're in heaven again. So that's the nature of closing the gap. And if someone has the ability to close the gap and pressure you so that you lose your balance, then you're on the ground. Well, once you're on the ground, size and all that doesn't matter anymore.
Yep.
So it was a beautiful experience. I ended up training with Machados for many years. And when I say that, don't get me wrong. I was there for years. I wasn't. I was there for 2 or 3 days at a time, every 10 or 12 days, 2 or 3 days at a time, every 2 weeks, things like that. But at one stage, probably about my 5th or 6th lesson at the Machados, I was sitting there during the free rolling. I'm sitting against the wall, and this purple belt walked up to me. It just came and sat down next to me. I said, "Hey." He goes, "Hey, g'day," and he shook hands. He said, "Where you from?" I said, "I'm from Australia." He said, "Oh, me too." And I looked at him. I said, "I know you." And he goes, no, you don't. He said, "I'd remember you." I said, "No, you brought out Bill Superfoot Wallace to Australia a number of years ago, and I arranged the Brisbane leg of the seminar tour." And I introduced myself, and it was John Donahue. And John Donahue, from that day on, he had the most incredible influence in my grappling life. It was phenomenal. He was the submission coach for Randy Couture and Dan Henderson and all the guys from what became known as R1 Gym. But in the early days, it was RAW, Raw, which was Real American Wrestling. And of course, there was the professional wrestling as well. And even though Rico Ciparelli and Raw had been around longer than Raw, the professionals just came along and said, don't stop using it. And he couldn't. You can't fight that machine. So he changed it to R1. But anyway, at this point, what was happening was John Donahue every morning was going to a place called Boxing Works down at Redondo Beach. And the Boxing Works was where Rico, Dan Henderson, Frank Trigg, Randy Couture, all these guys would get together every morning and train. And John Donahue was going as their submission coach, and he was helping them with their submissions. And so every now and then, whilst I'm there, I was joining in. I learned so much from those guys. I've still got scars to prove how serious guys like Dan Henderson and Randy Couture train. They were very nice. These guys are world class. Dan Henderson was an Olympic medalist. They're world class wrestlers, and I was a total noob at wrestling. But I had a lot of stand-up experience, so I'd help them with their hands, and I'd help them with the leg kicks and showing them how to work the timing of the leg kicks and things like that. And, I probably impacted on their life, maybe 5%, but they impacted on my life so immensely that even to this day, when I'm training at the BJJ school or teaching at the BJJ school, I'll do something and I'll say, this is how they taught me. This is how I learned a collar tie off these guys. This is how you should do it. This is the defense they showed me. John Donahue introduced me to Rico Ciparelli, Randy Couture, Vlad Matsienko, Frank Trigg, Dan Henderson, and even Eric Paulson. He was the first one to introduce me to Eric Paulson. And then even years later, after John Donahue had returned to Australia, I was still going to LA with Qantas. And, we moved hotels, unfortunately. We ended up down at Costa Mesa. But Costa Mesa was a car ride away from Fullerton in Orange County. And that's where Eric Paulson had his school. So whenever I could, I'd go and train with Eric Paulson as well. And I ended up having I still have a very good relationship with Eric Paulson. And I can tell you now, it's all learning on my part. Once again, I was in the right place at the right time. So I learned so much of those guys. And John Donahue graded me from white belt to brown belt in BJJ. Unfortunately, because he's in Melbourne, I'm in the Gold Coast. It was just really impossible to get down and see him, especially when I was bringing up kids. I was very, very hands-on with the children. So I just literally just couldn't get away. And when I'm away with Qantas, with work, and then coming back, well, of course, if I'm home for a week, it's not like I'm going to chuff off down to Melbourne, leave the kids at home and train with John. So unfortunately, I didn't get to train with John as much as I really wanted to. So, and yeah.
And LA at that time would have been such a melting pot, because you were talking about Boxing Works. I'm pretty sure that's where Forrest Griffin was coaching there for a while as well. So there would have been lots of influences from all sorts of different angles going on in the 90s and early 2000s.
Absolutely amazing. I lived in LA for 1 year, 1980. I was there for a completely different objective. And I used to train every day in the football field of the LA City College. And it was just like it was a beautiful thing. It was like you got athletes training, then you've got gymnasts over there, and then there were these group of martial artists, and they were like typical American style karate. And so I used to train with them. And I remember looking over one day, about 20 yards away was a gym, and there were guys in there training, and they were doing judo and grappling. Typical. I was only like 21 years old. I thought, I've got my karate. I'll stick to my karate. But it was Gene LaBelle, and Gene LaBelle was teaching there. And I missed out on that opportunity. Having said that, if I did go in there and get enraptured by what he was teaching, maybe my Kyokushin life would be very different now. But anyway, many years later, it turns out John Donahue, of course, is one of Gene LaBelle's 5 black belts, and he trained extensively with Gene LaBelle. He was introduced to Gene LaBelle by Superfoot Wallace. He'd gone to LA to do stand-up fighting, train with Bill Superfoot, and Bill introduced him to Gene LaBelle. And so at one stage, John introduced me to Gene LaBelle, and right up until he passed away, I used to speak to him pretty well every week. I'd phone him up every Friday just to see how he's going. But whilst John Donahue trained with Gene LaBelle regularly, consistently for many years, I didn't. I trained with him from time to time when I'm in LA. Gene was very nice. He was the most humble man, and humility is everything. And I'd ring him up and I go, "Oh, Uncle Gene," and he'd go, "You in town?" I go, "Yeah." He says, "You training tonight?" I said, "Are you?" He says, "I am if you are." And he go, "Oh, I'd love to train." He goes, "Okay, I'll pick you up at the hotel at 6:00. And he'd literally drive to my hotel and pick me up and take me to training. And we'd train at Gokor's gym in Hollywood. I remember at one stage, there were some pretty big names there. Ronda Rousey was a junior grade. She was a colored belt before the Olympics and all that. But anyway, Gene was so good. And then on days that he wasn't training, I'd go around to his house, and just the experience. Sometimes John would take me around to his house, and he had an upstairs office, and the walls were just plastered with recognitions and certificates and honors and things like this, And I have a really interesting story. In Kyokushin, we have the late John Blooming. He was like a mouthful of hot molasses. He was too hot to swallow and too sticky to spit out. And he was a bit of an iconoclast. He was high level in Kyokushin, even though he hadn't done a lot of Kyokushin, but what he had done a lot of was judo. He was super high level. He was at the level of Anton Geisink, who won the first Olympic judo heavyweight gold medal. I got to meet Anton Gasink the same day, would you believe, that I got to meet Dan Gable. They were both in Sydney for the Olympics. And I'd asked John Blooming, had he ever heard of Gene LaBelle? And he goes, no, I never heard of him. And he's like, if he'd never heard of him, he's no one. It's like John Blooming. It's either John Blooming and the guys he respects or no one,
Yep.
Which is funny because that's another story. But then at the same time, one day I said to Gene LaBelle, have you ever heard of John Blooming? And he goes, no, who's he? And, Gene LaBelle he won the US middleweight and open weight judo championship in the same year. And before the Olympics, the judo didn't start till 1964 in the Olympics. So in the 50s, the US team, they used to go over to the Kodokan and train with the Japanese. And Gene LaBelle's the only one who never lost at the Kodokan. It was quite significant. Some interesting stories about that. But
yeah, I only got to train with Gene once back in the 80s, and it left a lasting impression on me, that's for sure.
And he leaves lasting bruises on you too. Well, if he touches you, and it's a really interesting insight. When he grapples, his theory was, if you get an arm, you're going to break it. If you get a hold, you're going to hurt them. And, John Donahue even says that when he started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he was introduced to the Machados by Gene LaBelle. But when he started Jiu-Jitsu, he actually had to put aside a lot of the Gene LaBelle techniques that he learned because they were just too hard for the BJJ guys.
Yep.
They were too painful. So I said to Gene LaBelle, have you heard of John Bloom? Nah, I never heard of him. Who is he? I told him. He said, oh, okay. Well, anyway, one day I got an email from John Blooming, and he said, I'm in LA and I'm going to go and meet your friend, Gene LaBelle. I thought, oh, this will be interesting. So anyway, that happened. And then the next day I get an email to say, I went and met your friend, Gene LaBelle. He says, man, that guy knows his stuff. And John Blooming never says that about anyone. And then about 3 or 4 months after that, I was at Gene LaBelle's house, and there's a certificate on the wall, Kyokushin Budokai 10th Dan. And it was an honorary certificate from John Blooming. And I said, oh, you met John Blooming finally. And he goes, oh, yeah. You know what he said? He says, man, that guy knows his stuff. They both fell in love with each other because of the high quality and the realism of their pre-Olympic judo. Pre-Olympic judo is very different. Pre-Olympic judo is more like a combination of modern judo and BJJ. The early judo rules were 20-minute rounds, not 5-minute rounds. And if it went to the ground, you didn't have to do something in 25 seconds or whatever.
Yeah, and leg attacks were allowed, and
you could stay there for 20 minutes on the mat if that's what it took. So that was really interesting. John Blooming, I love him, but he gives out honorary certificates like Christmas cards. So a lot of people who have honorary, when I was a 4th Dan, he gave me a 6th Dan certificate. And I just, I thanked him for it, but I think it's still rolled up in my cupboard. And I know there are people who get 5th Dan, 6th Dan, 7th Dan certificates. They're just honorary certificates. They don't mean a thing. You may not have even trained with him. And if you did, you trained with him once. So it doesn't mean you're actually a 6th Dan in Kyokushin. It just means you got a gift from a man who loved giving away certificates as a gift. And I think that should be treated accordingly. But the only person I ever heard that he gave a 10th Dan to was Gene LaBelle.
Interesting. So we were just talking about the Olympics and how it's affected judo. Do you see the taekwondo's in the Olympics and now Muay Thai's in the Olympics and karate's back in the Olympics?
Is Muay Thai in the Olympics? I didn't know that.
Yeah, Muay Thai's in the Olympics now. So do you think that the Olympic, I would consider the Olympic curse, where every 4 years they change the rules, they play the political games and all the rest of it, do you think that's going to affect these other styles?
Well, it has, clearly. I mean, it affects judo incredibly, and the judo rules still keep changing. There was, a couple of times there you had high-level wrestlers, guys who'd had enough experience in wrestling to know how to time the leg shot. So they go to the Olympics and they wouldn't even engage in the grip. They just come flying in and do a double leg and take them down and get the points. So they cut leg attacks out of the judo. Anything that offended them, they just cut it out. And so this has meant that a lot of really strong judo techniques then went to the back. You got ura omote. Omote is the techniques you see in the front. Ura is the techniques that are hidden. And so I have no doubt that there are intelligent judo schools everywhere, and they still use all the techniques that are not allowed. Even in their kata, they still have strikes and so on. So I have no doubt that intelligent judo players will still use the techniques that are not permitted in competition, just like intelligent Kyokushin guys, when they train and work the Bunkai, they use the techniques that are not permitted in tournaments. And I say this with my tongue in cheek, but there's only 2 times in my life that I've felt like committing suicide. The first time was when I saw Taekwondo in the Olympics, and the second time was when I saw karate in the Olympics. Because when I saw the Taekwondo, I was disgusted to think that Taekwondo in any way is connected to anything I do. The way that they'd fight with their arms in front, and it was so not real Taekwondo.
Yep.
And then when I saw the karate in the last Olympics, and you can even see it in the athletes, these guys aren't karate fighters. They're athletes who have trained to a specific set of rules. And the whole thing was all about the reaction to stimulus, their ability to bridge the gap, their speed, footwork, their ability to get their hand out fast and get back. And it was just appalling.
Yeah,
When
because Yun was involved in getting Taekwondo into the Olympic. He was actually the chairman of the merging committee to try and get ITF and WTF to merge to get it into the Olympics. And as soon as it got announced that it was a demonstration sport in the Olympics, he resigned because he said that's the death knell of it. It's going to become a sport, not a martial art.
Yeah, and boxing's the same. If you look at Olympic boxing, it's a shadow of what it really should be. And if Muay Thai gets in, well, I can guarantee there'll be no elbows. They'll curb the rules in all kinds of ways. And look at Muay Thai. Look at the intense, incredible power that is Muay Thai. Could you imagine if they go to the Olympics and they have to wear shin guards and instep protectors? I just can't see how it's going to work.
Well, and then you've got MMA trying to sort of head down that path,
and BJJ's trying to get in, and all these sort of things.
Yeah, and I think the best thing they can do is avoid the Olympics.
Well, the Olympics are a big money machine. I mean, look at Ansett Airlines, the Australian airline company called Ansett. They tended to be the Sydney Olympic official airline, and the amount of money that they had to put up for that tender eventually put them under. The Ansett Airlines folded soon after the Olympics. And I remember the chairman of Qantas saying that's way too much, that there's no way that they can justify that. And so the Olympics is just a money thing. It's a money thing. You watch the walk-in parade, and some countries will have 2 athletes and 10 officials, and all this money is going to these officials, and it's like everyone wants a bite of the cherry, and the amount of money that is pushed towards it, because if a country can't make it any other way, they want to make it in sport. And so what they do is, when you've got this Cold War, not just between Russia and America, but between all the countries of the world, these countries that are trying to establish their presence, if they can't do it in any other way, they'll do it in athletics, they'll do it in sport. And so they push money to try and promote these sports. And when there's money involved,
Yep, exactly.
You've got to follow the money trail.
So what inspired you to write your book, The Budo Karate of Mas Oyama?
Well, of course, I'm a big Masayama fan. I'd seen him directly. I often read things about him and comments that people make, but those comments are usually made by people who spent very little, if any, time with him. So their comments are generally secondhand. They're not what you'd call a material witness. They weren't there firsthand. You speak to firsthand people, it's a different thing. I remember I spoke to one man who actually watched Masayama fight in the 1947 Japan Karate Championships, and that encouraged him to leave the current style he was doing and go and seek out Masayama and train with him. Even though Masayama, in many respects, he would never have won a kata tournament. His kata wasn't beautiful, but every single technique that he did in the kata was a knockout blow. He was very realistic, and sometimes someone would ask him about something and he'd go, no, that wouldn't work. Wouldn't work under pressure. And it may be an incredibly strong, gifted, powerful, intelligent technique. And he'd go, no, it wouldn't work. And they go, why? He says, because I tried it. It won't work under pressure. It'll fail under pressure. And he's right, And you speak to the guys who respectfully trained with him, in the early days. And there is nothing but awe and praise of how good this guy was. And so when I went to train with him in Japan, of course, I ended up being his interpreter as well. I wasn't his only interpreter, but I got called in for the third world tournament, fifth world tournament, the fourth world tournament. Even though I was fighting in the fourth world tournament, I did a lot of the interpreting before and after. Yeah. So, he was absolutely amazing. Those training sessions in the early days would go for 5 hours and people would come and go, come and go. And people who were there said he would never, ever let someone come and go without sparring him. So people used to come and challenge him all the time, but every one of them left humbled. And some of the stories which are unspoken are quite awe-inspiring. The power of his gaze. He always said that the true martial artist, the only thing that differentiates them is their gaze. A lot of martial artists wear funky clothes. They might wear, something different or grow their hair or do something else. They'll try to create this persona of a 15th century samurai or whatever. But Masayama said that's all wrong. The only thing that matters is their eyes. And he was famous for his gaze and according to first-hand reports, so quite often people would come in and they want to challenge him. And as soon as they'd shape up to him, they would sometimes they'd fall down on one knee or they just from the power of his gaze. And there's no doubt about it. I remember the first time Christine Wilby, the secretary at Hombu, ran down. I was training in the Ichibu in the morning's class, and she came down, stuck her head in. Obviously, Sorsai said, "Go and see if that young boy is there." She ran away. Then she came back down and she interrupted the class and said to the instructor that Masayama, Kancho, used to be Kancho, then not Sorsai. Kancho wants to see Cameron. So I went with her upstairs and she said, just stand at the door, say us, and wait till he calls you in. And I was standing at Sorsai's office and I went, us, and I'm standing and looking and he's working and he looks up and pulls his glasses down. And I literally almost lost my footing and balance just from his gaze. And then I had to steady myself with my elbow on the side of the door. And then suddenly he smiles and he goes, "Oh, please come in, come in." And he brings your energy back again. He used to look at people and he'd test them with that gaze to see if they're, whether they had the right intention or whatever. So I was very, very taken by his presence. And then over the years, traveling with him and interpreting for him, it reinforced it even more in that it's not so much what you see someone do in public. It's a bit like Trump. Lots of people say all kinds of things about Trump, but the ones who have actually met him speak very differently. So I don't care about US politics or Trump or whatever. But there was a thing recently with Bill Maher, and Bill Maher is very anti-Trump. For years, he's just maintained this rhetoric about how terrible Trump is. And then he got an opportunity to meet Trump recently at the White House, went for dinner. And his next session, it's worth looking at, his next TV session, he came away and he said, "I've got to admit that every single thing without exception that I thought about him was wrong." So it's a little bit like that Masayama. You can read all kinds of comments, commentaries, arguments, but unless you see someone at the quiet time when everyone else has gone home, I have a saying, character is the ability to keep a promise when everyone's gone home and you're standing naked in front of the mirror. Have you got what it takes to keep that promise that you made? And that's what character is. Well, Masayama was like that. I'd be interpreting for him. And invariably, as an interpreter, you don't exist in people's heads. This guy, this branch chief is having a conversation with Sorsai, and you're an unnecessary attachment. The conversation is between them, but you facilitate the conversation because you're interpreting. And sometimes I'll and usually they're pretty good. They go, "Oh, thank you." But you'd have to be there. You'd have to be at the breakfast table before everyone. And you're the last person to go to bed at night. And more than once, I'd get a phone call in my hotel room, like at 10 o'clock at night after everyone had gone. And it was Sorsai. And he'd go, "Oh, come to my room." So I go to his room and he'd sit me down. And he was just doing his thing. He was getting ready for bed. He was wandering around in his underpants and all that sort of stuff. And he'd make a couple of comments about something that had happened that day. One of those comments still remains very personal, very private. I've mentioned it a few times, talking about the secrets and hidden techniques of karate. But quite often he was the one who'd say, "Thank you very much. Really worked hard today and I really appreciate it." And that sort of kindness, really made a difference. So anyway, I'm running the dojo back in late 86. I retired from fighting in 87, the world tournament. one of the students asked me what the meaning of the names of the kata were. So I wrote like a 2-page thing explaining the meaning of the names. And I just Ronio'd that out. We didn't have printers back then. It was just a Ronio, and gave that out. And then someone else asked, what's the meaning of, what's the difference between a punch and a strike and a hit and this sort of thing. So anyway, that was the catalyst. And I just thought, man, there's just so much to talk about here. So in 1987, building up to the world tournament, and I know that because the books came off the printing press the morning that I took off to go to LA for the airport, to go to Japan for the world tournament. And Mick Young, another great Australian fighter, helped me. We took 6 boxes of the books to Japan. I'd been a very interesting story about how I approached Solsai with the fact that I was writing a book. But I said I was bringing the book, and my good friend, Willie Schultz, who was a graphic designer, designed the cover of the book and everything. He made this beautiful gold tasseled, gold embossed book box. And we put one of the copies of the books in that, and that was for Solsai. And I said to Solsai, when I went straight to Hombu, I said, "Oh, come in." I said, "I've got the book. The book's finished." And I don't know what he was expecting, but I have to say, I think Willie Schultz, the graphic designer, did a phenomenal job. The book is very beautiful. And I presented that to Solsai, and I swear he nearly cried to see this beautiful presentation box, and had a gold tassel on it, and you pull the tassel out and open it up, and there's the book. And so the book took 9 months. There was no home computers. People didn't have laptops then. So I used to go to the Ithaca TAFE. I lived in Ashgrove. The Ithaca TAFE College had what they called the Electronic Learning Center.
Yep.
And I used to go around there every day from morning to night. Wrote the book on a program called Multimate, which was an early precursor to, Word and that sort of thing. And then I'd finish the daily manuscript. The next morning, I'd take it finally, when I finished, I took it to a typesetter out at Albany Creek called Monoset Type. They're the sort of companies that don't exist anymore because it's all done digitally now.
Yeah.
And so they would create these galleys, which are just like plastic sheets and sheets of the book. And then I go back to Willie's office. This is after it was finished. So I wrote it at Ithaca TAFE, compiled it, proofread it, got one friend who was karate and a lawyer, another friend who was a lawyer, and another friend who was just karate, who I got them to proofread it, just from different aspects. And then I took off to Japan with the manuscript, showed Masayama, came back, did the paste up, and then the books came off the printing press the morning I headed off to Japan for the world tournament. That was the first edition. So I think I was inspired to write it by my own students because they were asking good questions. And I was also inspired to write it because when I said I lived in LA for a year, I was doing yoga. I was studying the yoga teachings of a man named Paramahansa Yogananda, who wrote the book Autobiography of a Yogi. And I was in Los Angeles for that just under 12 months doing that yoga. And so I had a very strong sense that there were the roots of Japanese martial arts philosophies were in India. And years later, Mas Oyama confirmed that. You have the concept of Shin Gi Tai. Mike Clark has written a great book called Shin Gi Tai. Shin meaning the mind, Gi meaning technique, and Tai meaning body. Shin Gi Tai. Another way to say it is Kokoro Waza Karada. Okay, Japanese, it's crazy. There are 5 different ways to say the same thing. So anyway, Masayama told me once, Shin, the mind aspect in Japanese karate, originates in India. Gi, the technical aspect of Japanese karate, originates in China. And Tai, the physical training approach to Japanese karate, originates in Korea, in influence of the Japan and Okinawa in the physical training. They use the chashi and and the focus on the lower body. And that's why karate guys traditionally trained have strong legs and strong hips. But it was interesting. He said that the mental side, the breathing techniques, all comes from India. And so that inspired me to write the book. So the main thrust, beside it being a biography of Masayama, was that I wanted to show the similarities between original Indian yoga and the martial arts, even to the point of how the colored belts and the progression through the belts is very similar to the progression in yoga.
Nice. So what does legacy mean to you? And what would you hope that your students remember from you and about your teachings?
Geez, that's a big question. Well, one of the teachings of Indian philosophy is don't do anything that creates shame. In other words, don't do something which later on makes you feel shameful. And you see it all the time. You can build an incredible life and it just comes crashing down in an instant when there's one thing that is revealed that you've done that is shameful. And it doesn't have to be high level. I mean, the number of people who have been exposed for sexual problems or that sort of thing. It doesn't even have to be that. It can be simply an act of disloyalty, an act of treachery. I think loyalty is a very high law. It's very important. And people can rationalize, justify 1,000 different ways why they're treacherous. But despite everything, despite my exposure to kickboxing, MMA, BJJ, I was always incredibly loyal to Mas Oyama, and he knew that. So I'd say, I'm going off and doing some kickboxing. And he'd look at me and go, oh, you're a good boy. Because he trusted the fact that it's not like I was going to wander off somewhere. Everything I did with the view of making my own Kyokushin stronger. And even to this day, when I'm doing BJJ, I'm having a roll with someone. I'm finding beautiful applications of karate techniques right there in the BJJ. I remember once I was training with Dan Henderson, and he said he had a problem in that when he's in someone's guard, they'll grab his wrists, and he wants to punch, but he can't. What can I do about it? So I showed him this very strong karate technique, a way of dealing with the wrist grab. And so even in karate, even in grappling, there's this incredible application of karate and vice versa. So legacy for me, I think, is a lifelong dedication to your chosen path without failing in a way that is shameful. And I think loyalty is very important. And I see it all the time. You can rationalize loyalty in 1,000 ways. And there's a group of guys, I see them all the time. They've done some training, and it's good training. I'm not disrespecting their skills, but what they do is they break away, they start their own thing, and they do their own thing, and they think they have this right to do their own thing. And they put themselves on an equal with some of the great leaders, and they're all doing the same thing. So they all support each other, and they give each other grades. We created this body and we're going to give this person a grade or that person a grade, and people get grades in different things they've never even trained in,
Yeah.
And to me, that's a form of shame. They should know better. If they've been trained longer, they should know better. It's just that simple. And I've been invited to that sort of thing, and I just go, yeah, thanks, no, I'm okay. So even though I'm very loyal to Kyokushin. When I finally settled at the Southport, and I was looking around for a BJJ school, there's so many of them. I chose Gracie Barra because in 1995, I think, when Pete the Bean brought Carlos Gracie Jr. to Australia, he asked me to look after the Queensland leg. So Pete the Bean brought out Carlos Gracie Jr., Marcio Feitosa, and Roberto Correa Gordo, who is famous for creating the half guard. And Marcio Feitosa went on to win 5 world titles. He was, I think, a brown belt. He might have even been given his black belt on the tour in Australia. But anyway, they all came out, and they actually stayed at my house at Surfers Paradise. And over the years, I'd had this sense of loyalty to Carlos Gracie Jr. In fact, for some reason, I used to keep running into him in the same restaurant in LA. We'd sit down and eat. When Qantas moved hotels, I'd go and train at his school. And so when I moved to Southport, and Gracie Barra was one of the schools of choice, it was very natural to me to go there because of my connection, in a sense of loyalty, with Carlos Gracie Jr. So I think loyalty is very important. Now, of course, loyalty also has to take into account the behavior of the person you're loyal to. If the person you're loyal to behaves in a way that is shameful or disrespectful to your instructor or their instructor, well, then it's like a CEO gets elected to be the head of a company, but if he screws up and does something illegal, they remove him like that. Well, it's the same thing. So I think loyalty, a legacy is a humble loyalty. I think that's pretty important. Plus, I think there has to be a lifelong learning. See, mastery only comes in one way, whether it's mastery of guitar or mastery of coffee. There are guys out there whose lives are dedicated to the perfect coffee, and it's incredible what they know about coffee. And mastery of the martial arts or mastery of running. There's only one way that you'll ever get there, and that's regular consistency. The difference between regularity and consistency is regularity is frequency, consistency is intensity. So it's one thing to train regularly. It's another thing to train consistently, that is with the same level of dedication and application. regular, consistent training over a long period of time. That's the only way you'll ever get there.
I totally agree.
So it defies me when I hear about people who, they do a little bit of training in something and then somehow they get a black belt in it. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. So I think a legacy is evidenced by regular consistency over a long period of time with a sense of humble loyalty.
Yeah,
and then
well,
you have to leave the rest in the lap of the gods. What people think of that, you're always going to have haters.
yeah, and you can't control what other people think of you. That's
No,
their issue.
that's it. Haters hate. And you know what I really hate is I hate people who hate. Haters hate. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you do. Some people just will be jealous or whatever it is, or, and they'll create false histories and all kinds of things like that. There's Peter Graham, the
Yep,
chief.
I know, Peter.
I have nothing but love and respect for him because of his humility. And of course, when they go to fight, pro fighters are all about selling the fight. So he put up this bravado and he created this image of himself, but he never backed down from anyone. And I remember he fought one of my students named Wally Schnaubelt. And I was at a camp in Melbourne, and one of the people in the crowd asked, there was Gary O'Neill, Judd Reed, Peter Graham, and myself, and we were sitting out the front. And one of the questions they asked was, the best opponent, the toughest guy you ever fought? And Peter Graham's Peter Graham. He could have said anything,
Yep.
but his humility was beautiful. He said, well, I have to say that as a Kyokushin fighter, the toughest guy I ever fought was Wally Schnaubelt. He fought Wally, got knocked out, and he didn't just back off and pretend that Wally didn't exist in his life like some people have done. What he did was he rang me up. When's Wally fighting next? When's his next tournament? And he went and fought in that tournament to fight Wally again. Got knocked out again. Got knocked out again. Got knocked out again. Got knocked out. He fought him 5 or 6 times and got beaten every time. Now, most people would lose once. I mean, I've even seen it in Kyokushin tournaments where someone gets tested in one division, so they'll change divisions to avoid that person, And Peter Graham never did that. He actually had the humility and the confidence to just keep going again and again and again, because he realized that fighting Wally was real key. And Wally Schnaubelt was something special, man. I mean, I remember in Singapore in '92 in the Singapore British Commonwealth titles, Kyokushin titles. Also, I love Sam Greco. Sam's incredibly imposing, impressive, and he sat down with Sam before the tournament, and so Sam was very dedicated to Kyokushin. He said, "I'm loyal. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay in Kyokushin forever." And then the next day, he fought Wally in the final, and Wally actually beat him. Went an extension or two. Sam was so tough, and even Sam said to me later that he knew when a punch had penetrated someone, but he felt when he hit Wally, he said not one single punch penetrated. He knew, and Wally was actually talking to Sam in the fight. Says, "Come on, Sam, let's go." And he beat Sam Greco in Sam's last Kyokushin fight. So Wally was pretty tough, And I think Gary O'Neill, everyone knows Gary. He was also one of my first live-in students, and he owes a lot to Wally too, because see, there's an old saying, I don't know if it's old, it might be new, but a lightweight should train like a heavyweight, and a heavyweight should train like a lightweight. And that's because the lightweight needs the qualities the heavyweight has. He needs the power and the ability to force forward and never back down. Whereas the heavyweight needs the qualities of the lightweight. He needs the speed and the agility and the footwork. And Wally, a heavyweight, and Gary, a lightweight, they were uchi-deshi together for years, and they would train together every day. And they even had a little personal handshake, just the two of them, that they had such a tight relationship, and they grew up in uchi-deshi training together. So Gary owes a lot to Wally, and Wally owes a lot to Gary, because Wally was very fast and very sharp for a heavyweight, and that has a lot to do with fighting Gary O'Neill every day.
Yep,
And vice
absolutely.
versa, Gary O'Neill, who was a lightweight, if anyone who's ever fought him just gets overwhelmed by how powerful his punches were and everything like that. So they were the perfect match. So that's why I really love Peter Graham and his approach and his humility. He's got that incredible confidence, as he should have. He beat Badahari, he knocked him out. He has this incredible presence, but the thing I love about him most is he's a family man. He loves his wife, loves his family, and he's very humble. And humility, they say that the waters of greatness gather in the valley of humility, and he's Very humble.
All right, Cameron, we better leave it there. Thanks for getting
Talk
on.
your ear off. Talk your ear off. Sorry about that.
That's good. That's good. Thanks for listening to It's Not About the Fight. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and keep up the hard work on and off the mat. Stay tuned for my next chat with another top coach or athlete.